There's a certain kind of deadline that isn't really about the date. It's about what happens before the date ever arrives. The silence, the waiting, the pressure, the calculation, because sometimes the most powerful weapon in politics isn't a tariff, a sanction, or even a law. It's a clock. A clock designed to make one side believe that every passing hour leaves them with fewer choices than the hour before. That's exactly what happened when Donald Trump announced that beginning on August 1st, the United States would impose 35% tariffs on many Canadian goods unless a new trade agreement was reached. To millions watching from the outside, the message looked simple. America had set the deadline, Canada would have to respond, the countdown had begun, but what happened next wasn't what Washington or anyone else expected. Instead of rushing toward the negotiating table, Canada's new Prime Minister Mark Carney slowed everything down. He didn't answer with panic. He didn't answer with dramatic speeches. He answered with something far more dangerous in a negotiation between two countries: patience. And that's where this story takes an unexpected turn, because the closer August 1st came, the more one question began spreading through political circles, financial markets, and boardrooms on both sides of the border. What if the countdown wasn't putting pressure on Canada anymore? What if the country that created the deadline had accidentally created one for itself? By the end of this story, you'll understand why this trade battle became about far more than tariffs, why both governments were playing completely different games, and why one quiet response from Ottawa may have changed the psychology of the entire standoff. Every major negotiation has a moment when everything changes. Not because a deal is signed, not because someone walks away, but because one side decides to introduce a deadline. Deadlines are powerful because they change the way people think. The moment a specific date appears on the calendar, every conversation starts revolving around it. News organizations begin counting down the days. Businesses begin making contingency plans. Investors begin asking difficult questions. Markets become nervous. Even people who never follow politics suddenly start paying attention because uncertainty has been given a timetable. That's exactly what happened when Donald Trump publicly declared that beginning on August 1st, tariffs on many Canadian exports entering the United States would rise to 35% unless significant progress was made in trade negotiations. At first glance, it looked like a familiar negotiating tactic. Set a deadline, increase the pressure. Force the other side to make concessions before the clock reaches zero. It's a strategy that has appeared countless times in politics and business. The side with greater leverage creates urgency, hoping urgency will accomplish what months of negotiations could not. For many observers, the assumption was immediate. Canada depends heavily on the American market. A significant share of Canadian exports, from automobiles and auto parts to aluminum, steel, lumber, energy, and agricultural products, crosses the border into the United States every single day. Those supply chains weren't built overnight. They developed over decades, linking factories, ports, railways, pipelines, and thousands of businesses into one deeply connected North American economy. Because of that relationship, many believed Canada had little choice but to respond quickly. The logic seemed straightforward. If tariffs became reality, Canadian exporters would face higher costs. American buyers could begin searching for alternative suppliers. Investment decisions might be delayed. Manufacturing plans could change. The uncertainty alone could influence hiring, production, and financial markets before a single tariff was even collected. That's why the deadline itself mattered almost as much as the tariff. The countdown became part of the negotiation. Every day without an agreement created fresh headlines. Every hour increased speculation. Would Canada compromise? Would Washington soften its position? Would both sides reach a last-minute agreement like they had during previous trade disputes? Nobody knew. And uncertainty is often one of the strongest forms of economic pressure. But while television panels debated possible outcomes, something unusual was happening inside Ottawa. Mark Carney wasn't treating the deadline the way many expected. There were no dramatic emergency announcements promising immediate concessions. There were no public signs of panic. There were no rushed appearances suggesting Canada was preparing to accept whatever terms were placed on the table simply to avoid August 1st. Instead, Carney projected something negotiators rarely display when facing an approaching deadline: time. Not because more time existed. The calendar hadn't changed. August 1st was still approaching. But the psychology had begun to shift. Rather than acting as though every passing day weakened Canada's position, his government signaled that any response would be measured, calculated, and based on Canada's long-term interests instead of short-term political pressure. That difference may sound subtle. It wasn't. Because deadlines only work when one side believes running out of time is worse than accepting a bad deal. If that belief begins to disappear, the entire balance of a negotiation starts changing. And that's where this story becomes much bigger than one tariff announcement. Because while most people were staring at the calendar, both governments were quietly preparing for something far more important than August 1st itself. They were preparing for what would happen the day after. Here's the part most people missed. When governments issue deadlines like this, they're usually betting on something much bigger than the policy itself. They're betting on human behavior. Think about it. The moment a countdown begins, people start imagining the worst-case scenario. Companies delay investments, importers rush to place orders before prices rise, exporters worry about losing contracts. Markets begin pricing in uncertainty long before any new rule actually takes effect. That's how deadlines create leverage. The pressure often arrives before the policy does. And for a few days after Trump's announcement, that's exactly where the conversation stayed. News outlets focused on the number. 35%. They focused on the date, August 1st. Every headline seemed to ask the same question. Could Canada afford to let this happen? But notice what almost nobody was asking. What happens if Canada refuses to panic? Because that possibility changes everything. When Mark Carney finally addressed the situation, he didn't attempt to match Trump's rhetoric. He didn't respond with emotional language or dramatic warnings. Instead, Canada's message remained remarkably consistent. If new American tariffs were imposed, Canada was prepared to respond with countermeasures of its own while continuing negotiations. That may sound predictable. Almost every country promises retaliation during a trade dispute. But this wasn't really about retaliation. It was about removing the psychological advantage that the deadline was supposed to create. The original countdown assumed one country would spend every passing day trying to avoid August 1st. Carney's response suggested Canada was preparing for August 1st instead. That distinction matters, because preparing for a deadline is completely different from fearing it. The moment businesses believe a government already has contingency plans, part of the uncertainty begins to disappear. Markets don't like surprises. They don't necessarily love tariffs either. But investors generally prefer a bad plan over no plan at all. And that seemed to be the signal Ottawa wanted to send. Canada wasn't pretending tariffs wouldn't hurt. Nobody serious was making that argument. Higher trade barriers between two economies this closely connected would inevitably create higher costs, disrupted supply chains, and difficult decisions for businesses on both sides of the border. The real message was different. Canada intended to manage the consequences instead of negotiating from fear. That alone altered the conversation. Because negotiations rarely depend only on economic strength. They depend on perception. Who looks nervous? Who appears confident? Who seems to need an agreement more urgently? Those questions influence every meeting before a single word is spoken. Imagine two people negotiating across a table. One keeps checking the clock every few minutes. The other sits comfortably, asks questions, and never mentions the time. Before numbers are even discussed, the balance has already shifted. That is exactly why deadlines can become dangerous for the side that creates them. If the other side refuses to react emotionally, the deadline slowly starts putting pressure on the person who announced it. Every day that passes raises a new question. Will they actually follow through, or will they blink first? That's a difficult position for any government. Following through may increase economic costs. Backing away may create political costs. Neither option is painless. And this is where the story becomes far more complicated than headlines about tariffs. Because while public attention remained fixed on speeches, letters, and social media posts, another battle was unfolding almost entirely outside the spotlight. Canadian officials weren't only discussing tariffs, they were also talking about supply chains, energy infrastructure, export capacity, trade diversification. None of those topics produce dramatic headlines. They don't trend online. They're slow, technical, sometimes even boring, but over the long run, they matter far more than any single tariff announcement. Because the greatest leverage in international trade doesn't come from winning one negotiation. It comes from reducing the number of negotiations where someone else holds all the leverage. That isn't something any government can accomplish in a week, or even a year. Building new export routes, expanding infrastructure, strengthening relationships with other trading partners, and encouraging investment all take time. Lots of it. But every step in that direction changes the calculation. The more options a country has, the less vulnerable it becomes to pressure from any single customer. And that's why some analysts began looking beyond August 1st entirely. Maybe this wasn't only a fight about tariffs. Maybe it was becoming a fight over the future structure of North American trade itself. One side appeared focused on immediate leverage. The other appeared increasingly focused on reducing future dependence. Those are completely different strategies. One tries to win today's negotiation, the other tries to change tomorrow's negotiation altogether. And if that's what was really happening beneath the surface, then August 1st was never the finish line. It was only the beginning. Because the closer the deadline came, the more another question started emerging, one that could ultimately determine who held the stronger hand. What if the biggest economic consequences weren't waiting in Canada at all? What if they were waiting inside the United States?